Are you ready to take your business to the next level? Every day there are countless books and articles that are published offering the key on how to make your business a success. It's easy to feel overwhelmed trying to keep up and run your business. That's why Deb Creer created the Business Power Hour. Keep up on the latest trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. Let the Business Power Hour do the heavy work for you.
Good morning. Good morning. I am Deb Creer, and I am passionate about giving professionals the tools that they need to make themselves and their businesses as successful as possible. And today we're going to be talking about something that is obviously very near and dear to my heart, and that's podcasting and why it is so incredibly important. We're going to be speaking with a young man who has made it his entire career. Oh my gosh. So please join me in welcoming Noah Tetzner to our program today. Welcome, Noah. How are you?
I'm doing great, Deb. There's nowhere else I'd rather be on this beautiful Wednesday morning than with you here on the show. And I was telling you before we hit record, I feel like I've known you for a while. I've been a listener of your podcast for many years, so this is a treat for me.
Well, thank you so much. And you have also sent us several great guests, and we'll be talking a little bit about that because that's one of the things that people always ask me is how do you get your guests, especially when we're at 1009, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's just one of the things. So let me tell people a little bit about you, and then we will jump into this. So after growing his first show to 50,000 downloads per month within just 5 months of launching, mind you, at the age of 16, Noah Tetzner decided to make podcasting his life's work. He has grown, monetized, and produced podcasts for companies such as Alibaba.com, Siemens Energy, Nolan, Auerbach White, which is the leading healthcare fraud lawyer firm, Scott Dikkers, founding editor of The Onion, and many more. Noah's mission is to help entrepreneurs get more clients and grow a massive audience. So again, Noah, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Deb. Yeah, listening to all of that, it's kind of like, whoa, it's been a blur. You know what I mean? I'm just having so much fun doing this.
I know. We were talking about that before the program started, that, because people will say, why do you do this?
Yeah.
Because it's fun.
Yes.
And folks, if it is not fun, don't do it or figure out why it's not fun. And we'll talk about maybe some tips and techniques in that. But I mentioned that this is your career. So
Yeah.
tell us how it is that you got to where you are today.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story, Deb. So I was 16 and I was 16, right? And that's kind of the age in life where a lot of people are thinking, okay, what do I want to be when I grow up? Like 18, graduating high school, that deadline is looming.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about that myself, and I knew that I didn't want to go to college for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, that's what I knew. And I, at the time, was apprenticing with my father, who owns a real estate appraisal firm where I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we would drive to his inspections all over the state. And when we would do that, we'd listen to podcasts. And we'd mostly listen to business podcasts. And, my dad was saying, he'd say to me like, Noah, why don't you start a podcast? And I'm like, Dad, what am I going to podcast about? And he's like, well, you love history. And that's like one of my big interests. I'm like a history nut. So he's like, well, why don't you start a podcast about history? So we had talked about that for a few years. And one time he bought me some podcast equipment for Christmas. And that sat in a box for about 2 years. And then in 2018, I finally started a show. I bought the domain name. I was really into Vikings. And
well, you do live in Wisconsin, the land of the Vikings, right?
Exactly. So I started a podcast. I bought the domain, thehistoryofvikings.com. And I just reached out to my first guest, sent her an email named Caroline Larrington, the professor of medieval literature at Oxford University.
Wow.
And I had heard her on another podcast and did some sleuthing and found her, university email, and she agreed to come on the show. And I had so much fun because, like here I am at 16 years old getting these private history
Mm-hmm.
lessons from these PhD scholars, and she
Mm-hmm.
introduced me to some of her friends, and next
Mm-hmm.
thing you know, within 5 months of launching the show, 50,000 people were tuning in
Wow.
every month.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really, I was new to podcasting at the time,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't know if that
Mm-hmm.
was considered good or kind of what. Um, but it was cool because then sponsors started approaching
Mm-hmm.
me. A company who was doing an event in York in the UK flew me out to do some media coverage for their
Cool.
event. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book about Viking
Mm-hmm.
battle tactics with one of the largest military history publishers, and the light bulb started to go off like, man, I could do this full time. Like
Mm-hmm.
I could make a career out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was originally a passion project.
Mm-hmm.
But now what I love to do is help other people grow, start, and
Mm-hmm.
monetize their podcasts.
Right. So I'm guessing the first question you get is why? Why do I need to be doing this as part of my business?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, Deb. What it all comes down to is net new relationships for your
Mm-hmm.
business, new clients, strategic partners, referral partners,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, in 2024, at the time of our recording, a lot of people are reaching out to people in different ways. You can send someone a cold email, you can call
Mm-hmm.
them on the phone, you can DM them on Facebook or
Mm-hmm.
LinkedIn. But people are just bombarded by so much
Right.
communication. So the best way to generate new relationships is through authentic, genuine conversation. So,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I advocate for is if there's somebody who you think, man, it would be awesome to work with them in some capacity, or at least I'd love to have them in my network and build a relationship, start a podcast and invite them on your show.
Mm-hmm.
Have a conversation with them for 30 minutes or an hour where you're
Mm-hmm.
just asking questions and listening. I mean, that's rapport building
Right.
101 is
Mm-hmm.
asking questions and
Mm-hmm.
listening. And all of a sudden, after you stop the recording, you feel like you've known each other for years. It's
Oh,
like this,
definitely. Mm-hmm.
right? It's this magic effect. And kind of the elephant in the room at that point in my experience is like, man, this was so fun. How can we collaborate more? How
Mm-hmm.
can we, you know what I mean? So I think that podcasting is the best way to get new clients and
Mm-hmm.
expand your business. And there are so many benefits that come along with it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I've made lifelong friends. I was just in Nashville, Tennessee, staying with some people I met through
Mm-hmm.
podcasting. I was in Iceland a month ago, staying with
Mm-hmm.
somebody that I met through podcasting. It's a great way to build
Mm-hmm.
relationships with people that can really move the needle for your business.
Right. And you did get a major client when you were just, starting out. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting, Deb. So I remember that there was one occasion, and I had been running my so just to back up a little bit. So what happened was this. So after I started my podcast about Vikings,
Mm-hmm.
um I started to do some freelance work.
Mm-hmm.
I created a profile on Upwork at the time and really put a lot of energy into
Mm-hmm.
that, and was actually generating about $8,000 a month just off of Upwork,
Wow.
helping people
Mm-hmm.
with their podcasts. And
For fun. I
for
mean, you were making
fun.
money, but you were like, hey, this is fun.
This is fun. I
Mm-hmm.
loved it. I loved it because, I wanted to help other people do what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
And more than anything, like, this is like a business show, right? But
Mm-hmm.
podcasting allowed me to express myself.
Right.
Before I
Mm-hmm.
started my podcast, I felt like I really didn't have an avenue where I
Mm-hmm.
could talk about
Mm-hmm.
history, which was my
Mm-hmm.
passion. Was doing a lot on Upwork, freelancing. I also got some jobs working in different
Mm-hmm.
marketing agencies while I was freelancing
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to learn everything there was to know
Mm-hmm.
about marketing
Mm-hmm.
and sales funnels and that process. Eventually, I started my own agency, which I run today, called Profit with Podcasting. I've been
Mm-hmm.
doing it for 6 years now. And I got a client through podcasting that ended up generating $50,000 for the business in 1 year. And
Wow.
basically how it worked, Deb, is I started a show called Profit with Podcasting, which is also the name of my business. I started a show called Profit with Podcasting, and it was January of 2022, and I knew that I wanted to grow my business a lot that year. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to invite 10 guests on that podcast who I think could be potential clients or strategic partners, and also just people that I've been kind of stalking on LinkedIn and wanted to work with.
Right.
So I recorded 10 interviews with different people, marketing agency owners, thought leaders, that sort of thing. And out of those 10 interviews, 3 of them became clients, and one of them ended up becoming a white label partner. So basically, he was a marketing agency owner, and he would white label, my podcasting service for all of his clients.
Oh, wow.
And that's something that happened through podcasting. And one thing I just want to illustrate for people that are listening to kind of this strategy and they're thinking about how they can apply it for their own business. So I had interviewed him as a guest, and then we had a great conversation, built some rapport. He then interviewed me on his show. And then probably about 4 months later, I invited him back on my podcast. And he, and after that is kind of when I presented this option of, hey, I think we could work together. And here's how I think we could upsell some of your existing clients through my services. And really the rest was history. And he had also heard me as a guest on another podcast. So like the more you do this, and the more you're creating content, the more kind of just things are going to happen for you.
Right. Well, because there is that little thing called SEO. And
Absolutely.
so if somebody Googles your name, all of those podcasts are going to come up if they did the right thing in putting your name in the show notes. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just, and so even if you're just being a guest on multiple programs, that's a fabulous way to get your name out there. I'm doing that right now for the initiative that I started to help those with cancer. I'm a guest on other people's podcasts, which is really very different, right? Than doing, being on the other side of the mic is always great fun. And I do several of those a week. And so now when people Google my name, there's a lot that comes up, and we all know it's, it used to be when, somebody would do a search, you might look for 2 or 3 pages of Google, right? You'd scroll and, page down and do whatever it was.
Yeah.
Now we look at like the top 5, right. and the top 3 are usually sponsored. And so then what comes up? And so you want your name to come up, and especially if you are a business owner, or a consultant, whatever it is that you do, you want your name coming up, and you want it coming up in a good way, not a bad way.
Right. No, absolutely, Deb. Like, and that's the thing too, is that's one of the things that I love about podcasting too, is people oftentimes when they work with me will have listened to me being interviewed as a guest on other podcasts or some of the episodes I've produced myself before they even work with me, which is awesome because right, especially in like the service-based business where kind of what we're selling is this kind of invisible high ticket offer. It's this results-based thing. People have to, people aren't just buying a $30 e-commerce product. They're typically doing a lot of research before they hire you.
Right.
So if they're able to listen to a full, kind of 40-minute interview about your area of expertise, that's an excellent way to get your message across in an authentic way.
Right. And the next question that always comes up is, doesn't it cost a lot? Yes, there is an investment, but it is not nearly what most people think it is. Now the first thing, folks, audio is key.
Yeah.
If people cannot hear you or understand you, they're not going to continue. And so even though we are doing this on Zoom, and there's, certainly lots of other platforms now for video, I tell people I love recording using Zoom because I can see my guests. I mean, that's so it's more like we are sitting and having a cup of coffee. We have a YouTube channel, doesn't get all that many viewers. We like to think that we're fun and scintillating, but not an hour's worth of people watching. They're going to listen, much like you did with your dad. They listen in the car, they listen while they're working out. So it's critical that you have good internet and good and reliable internet connection. I mean, that's just that it shouldn't go without saying, but there are people who, I did an interview one time with somebody, and I could hear this racket, and this was before we had video that we were doing.
Yeah.
And I finally said, I'm sorry, what is that? He said, oh, I'm sitting on my deck and they're cutting down trees next door. I said, please go inside. Right. And now I did it one time. It was really funny. You could hear splashing and kids laughing. I'm like, are you by a pool? And she said, yes, that's part of my story, is I can work while sitting by the pool. Okay. And so, but it wasn't distracting. I mean, but yeah, you have to have good audio. You have to have a host, someplace where your podcasts live. And there's a variety of places for that. Again, that's not a huge expense per month. Mine is considered advertising because I'm talking about what I do for a living. And so that makes my accountant happy and makes the IRS man happy. My microphone, I bought it several years ago for $200. It's probably $100 now. And I use an earpiece. I call it my CIA earpiece because if I did headphones, it would mess my hair up. But some people prefer headphones, things like that. But you have to have kind of those basics. But it's not a huge expense. And then really you just find your guests. So that's the next question I always get. So I'm going to ask it of you. How do you find your guests?
That's a good question, Deb, and it's not really that hard, to be honest. It's not that hard.
I love how you just picked, and you really shot for the stars with your very first guest. I mean, now, did you tell her that you'd never done it before, or?
Yeah. I mean, I did, but that's the thing, Deb, is so number one, I'll just say first and foremost, it only really takes one good guest or one acclaimed guest who's not even necessarily a celebrity, and it makes getting any guest after that easier. It's a snowball effect. But in my case, with my first show, The History of Vikings, the people that I was going after really weren't interviewed all that often. Like these PhD kind of historian
so they were
professors.
Honored.
They were. And it was such a niche thing. Like, wow, somebody's doing a podcast about Vikings, and that's my area of expertise. So they loved to do it. They saw my passion. And when I reached out to her, I demonstrated that I was familiar with her work. I mean, I had read a little bit of her book. I had listened to another interview that she gave. So it showed that I was legit, and I was, a professional, even though the show was new. Typically, I get all of my guests for all of my shows via email. That's typically how I do it. Email or LinkedIn DM, whichever. And like I said, it really only takes one kind of like, good guest, and then it's so much easier after that. But really it's not that difficult, because people want content. So even if you don't have a large audience, if you can say, hey, we'll send you a link to this interview as soon as it's live, even better if you say, hey, we can produce a few different video snippets for social media, or give you the raw audio so your marketing team can use that to create social content. People always need good content.
They want that social proof.
They do. So you're giving them that. You're giving them publicity and a platform.
Right. And when I first started out, I was actually on a radio station, on Mile High Radio, and we called the program The Socialite. And we talked about social media. This was long enough ago that was when Facebook and LinkedIn had been around a little bit, but people thought, okay, we cut and paste our resume. They really didn't have much knowledge about it. So, I thought, oh, hey, this will be fun. Let's do 10 episodes of, how people can use social media for business. And then it just, snowballed from there. But I discovered, of course, that yes, after so many years of doing this, people come to me. Right. I get pitched probably 2-3 times a day at least. And I send them off to my producer. And you actually pitched yourself back in May. I looked it up just to see how long you
Oh,
very
wow.
patiently waited. So yeah, it was May. And so, we do kind of have this ongoing thing, and doing 2 a week. I mean, that does give us, 100-ish interviews per year. So, we've got quite a bit, but I also discovered it's like you said, you have to ask. Just ask.
Yes.
In all of my time, I've been turned down twice. And one was somebody who he said, I can't talk for an hour. But and an hour does kind of intimidate people. And I tell them, okay, first of all, it's my job to make sure that we can talk for an hour. And even people who say they can't do it, we get to the top of the hour and they're like, no, I'm not done. But
Yes.
it's we also, and he really didn't think he could. And I said, I just watched you give a 45-minute presentation.
Right.
But he just clearly didn't want to do it. And then there was another who was like I said, this was, social media was the content, the primary content. And he was the editor of one of the biggest online social media review magazine platforming
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And he said, I would be delighted. Here's the information for my assistant. She is who schedules my calendar. Contact her. And she said, he was being polite. Don't bother him again. And
Interesting.
I thought, huh. And then it was, okay, do I go back to him and say, excuse me? And I just let it drop. It was like, no, for whatever reason, and she was, a lot of times our admin assistants are our gatekeepers. She
Right.
might have just, and all of that. And so, yeah, I did. I just let it drop. Well, then, once our program got bigger, he came to us and said, I want to be interviewed. And I turned him down and I told him why. And he apologized and he said she shouldn't have done that. And he said, but I understand why you didn't want to talk to me. Now, was that a little petty on my part? Sure. But yeah, I mean, you're not going to get yes if you don't ask, and at
Yes.
the very least you get no. But for the most part, now I might get, can't do it now. Can we do it in several months? Sure.
Right.
All sorts of things. Many times it's, hey, I've got a book coming out in, X period, or, seminar or something. I want to wait and talk about that. That's fine. We've got more than enough guests. And I still ask guests, every once in a while, I will come across one that it looks very interesting. So
Yeah.
I will reach out to them. Or, it's somebody that I'm connected with and they'll be talking about something like, okay, we did that several weeks ago where a woman who I knew very well from my networking time in Denver completely changed careers. And I hadn't realized it until I saw her posting about it on Facebook. I said, okay, this has got to be something we talk about. So it was just a great way to reach back to her and say, hey, it's
Yeah.
been, several years since we chatted. But, you folks, you just have to ask. But as Noah said, you have to be professional about it. Here's what we're going to talk about. Here's the format of the program, things like that. And when they say, and how many listeners do you have? You may or may not have a number. I find that's not a big deal to people. What I tell them is I have listeners from around the world, which we do.
Hmm.
About 30% of our listeners are outside the US. The tricky thing is you don't get a lot of demographics. You're not going to say, hey, a 35-year-old housewife in Cleveland listens to this program. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Right.
But you can say, here's what we have that we know of.
Yeah.
And you have a huge number. Sometimes numbers, if you're talking to the right audience, 100 might be perfect.
Yes.
So, that's the thing too. But yeah, you just have to start and do it.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'll say, Deb, is, in terms, so like one of the things that I want to highlight to people is I've done probably like 6 different podcasts
Mm-hmm,
over the last 6 years. Some of them are still running, some of
mm-hmm,
them aren't, because I just did one of these things where it's like, okay, I'm going to do 15 episodes and
mm-hmm.
explore this topic and then just put a pause on
Right.
that and maybe
Yeah.
I'll
It's
come
like a
back to it.
mini series.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm,
But all of my podcasts, every single podcast I've ever done in
mm-hmm,
some way has made me money
mm-hmm,
and contributed to my business.
mm-hmm,
But some of them don't really get that many downloads. So,
mm-hmm,
I mean, so that show, Profit with Podcasting, that I
mm-hmm,
got the 50,000
mm-hmm.
50,000 K client from, um, in its peak, that podcast was doing 200 downloads a month.
Mhm.
Right? Like that's not the point.
Right.
And like you said, Deb, not as many people as you would think if you haven't done podcasting are
Mhm.
asking for download
Mhm.
metrics.
Right.
Um
Mhm.
and I
Again,
know
they just want to be heard and they want to have that content.
exactly. Exactly. No, that's absolutely
Mhm.
right.
And for anybody out there who's thinking people don't care about my podcast, they don't care about my subject matter, there is something, and just Google it just to see. I mean, it's amazing what you find out there. The
Yeah.
sad thing is none of us are unique anymore, right? Now we ourselves are unique, and we're unique in how we're going to approach what we're doing, but our topics are probably not unique any longer. I went to Podfest. I've been to Podfest a couple of times. Great
Yeah.
fun. Whether you're a beginner or somebody who has been doing this for 1,000 episodes, there's a lot of fun stuff. And I was chatting with a woman, very professional looking woman, and I said, "And what is your podcast?" And she automatically turned 8 shades of red, and I thought, okay. And her podcast, believe it or not, was about S&M and bondage. And I was, so then I turned 8 shades of red. And she said she does it under a pseudonym because she is a professional person.
Mhm.
And she said, but they actually have a pretty big listenership. And I mean, we've all listened to podcasts about how to, whatever it is. I think, throw anything out there and there's going to be at least one podcast about it. But again, it's your unique spin on it that is going to get yourself the audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in my career, Deb, I've worked with podcasts about almost everything under the sun. I mean, there was
Mhm.
one podcast that I worked on for quite a while, and it was called the Gas Compression Podcast. Right. And
Mhm.
it was basically, it's been a few years since I worked on that.
Mhm.
But it was basically somebody in the oil business looking to sell drill bits for
Mhm.
those, I don't even know what the
Right.
technical term is, but those oil mining machines.
Yeah, those thingies that go, yeah.
Yeah, they go
Mhm.
up and down like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that was the whole premise of the
Mhm.
podcast, is interviewing
Mhm.
experts in
Mhm.
the oil industry. Like, you couldn't get more niche than that.
Right.
But the reason the person was
Mhm.
doing the show is because they wanted a way, they
Mhm.
wanted a platform to
Mhm.
connect with potential partners and clients. And podcasting is such a great way
Mhm.
to do that.
Right. And now mine is an hour, the business
Yeah.
power hour. And I always laugh. I have a guest probably once every 3 months that says, now, how long is it? Well, and I have done two that were 30 minutes. One was a gentleman who I wanted on the program. I had gone after him. He was somebody I knew. And he said he never did more than 30 minutes. It was
Mm,
just his, and I thought, okay, if I want him, I have to, and so I did. And then I had another gentleman who, partway through, or actually it was right before we started, had an emergency, and he said we can either reschedule, or he said we can just do 30 minutes, and I said, well, let's just do 30 minutes. And I did have one guy come on one time, and he said he was pitching, he was doing an online book tour, right? So he was doing
yeah.
podcast after podcast after podcast, and he very egotistically said, now I can give you 15 minutes. And I said, no. And so, and it kind of took him back. And I said, it is the business power hour.
Yeah.
And he paused and he said, I'm sorry. My people have screwed up. They have double booked me. He said, you send me the link and I'll make sure that I set aside enough time. And so then we did, and we had a great interview. But yeah, it was, well, I can give you 15 minutes. No, you can't.
Right.
And that's, I think, one of the things as the host, you're in charge. You can decide, how much give and take you want to do, if you're going to deal with divas. I've never really had, any divas besides that I can give you 15 minutes person. And I have talked with some of the biggest names, anybody who is familiar with the marketing world knows Peter Shankman. I've had
Right.
Peter on several times. He is the funniest guy in the world. He's one of the few people, when we were actually doing the live program, I had to cut off. he just wouldn't stop talking.
Yeah.
And so, and that is the nice thing about once it is a podcast, because you are more flexible with the time. You can go longer, you can go shorter, all of those various things. But, it is, as we were saying, it's a great way to meet people. And for me, that's the biggest benefit.
Yeah.
I love doing what I'm doing and just reaching out and connecting with people from around the world.
I
I
know.
should do a map sometime and figure out where I've had guests from.
So, so Deb, so this is episode 1009 of the Business Power
Yes.
Hour.
Mm-hmm.
What, I know I'm not going to interview you, but I have to ask because you're
Well,
such
now
a
I'd
good
love to
case
be on your
study.
podcast.
We will make it happen. That's for certain. But,
See, you just have to ask.
you just have to ask.
Mhm.
Exactly. But what would you say? Because again, you're such a great case study
Mhm.
for podcasting. Like, what has this show done for you? What have you loved about
Mhm.
doing this over the last so many years?
I learn something every time. I think
Yeah.
that is probably one of the most important things. And so I go into it thinking, what am I going to learn? Because if I'm learning, then I hope that my audience is learning also. And there have been times, I'll be really honest, where I look at it and I think, ooh,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And sometimes those are the most fascinating, because what that usually means is I don't know anything about that subject. And
Mm.
so then it's a great opportunity for me to learn more about it. One of my guests one time was 18 years old,
Yeah.
already earning almost seven figures. And
Wow.
his business was completing and submitting SBA, so small business loans, to the government on behalf of other businesses. And
No
he took a
kidding.
commission from those. And I'm like, you're 18? And he recorded it in his bedroom in his parents' house. I mean, it was just the funniest thing in the world. His mom came in with the laundry in the middle, right? Um,
Right.
and he was absolutely fascinating. I mean, he hired his buddies to help.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, how did you get into doing this? Well, he was 16, must be the magic number, right? And he filled out a SBA loan for a little business that he was doing, and he got it. And somebody else said, hey, can you do that for me? Hey, can you do that for me? And then pretty soon he thought, seems like there's money in this.
Yes.
And I started thinking, okay, this is going to be boring. Who wants to talk about SBA loans? But knowing more about him was what made it an interesting program.
Wow. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And that's what I love about your program, Deb, is you've had the biggest names in business on the show, but then you've also had people like that
Mm-hmm.
who, aren't necessarily as well known yet, but their story and
Fascinating.
expertise
Mm-hmm.
is just fascinating,
Right, right.
you know?
Yeah, I've had Bob Berg, Peter Shankman, other people like that, and they are absolutely wonderful to talk with, to get to know, things like that. But sometimes it is the people who started a pretty small business, and they might still be a small business, who are the most fascinating to hear their stories and to hear their tactics and things. And and have we done some non-business podcasts? Sure. I tell people it's my podcast. I could do what I want with it.
Yeah,
During,
absolutely.
but I do try and give it a business, theme, or
Mhm.
in there somewhere. During COVID, I interviewed nutritionists,
Mm,
mental health people, right? Because that
yes.
got to be a really big issue for a lot of people. And just, and have there been some that absolutely did not pertain to business? A couple, but it was because I thought they would be so interesting that my listeners would want to hear it. And
And
so that's the thing.
that's what I love about your show too, Deb, is, people ask me all the time, well, what questions should I ask my guests on my
Mm-hmm.
podcast? And, there's some, I mean, you could Google that and you'd find some good
Right.
results. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I always say is like, just have a genuine
Right.
curiosity. Like
Mm-hmm.
ask a question
Mm-hmm.
where you're going, man, like I would
Mm-hmm.
love to know the
Mm-hmm.
answer. And I always think
Mm-hmm.
of my podcast interviews as like like free coaching calls, free
Right.
consulting
Yeah.
calls.
We used to go to Starbucks and spend an hour with somebody. Now we do this.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so that creates the best content
Mm-hmm.
is when it's like this, just
Mm-hmm.
having a
Right.
conversation.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it there is a format that we follow, obviously. But the key is, as you said, we as the host have to have done our homework. If someone is an author, I try to at least skim their book. If they want to talk about their book, I had better be able to say, oh my gosh, in chapter 3, I love the story about. Um, Now, if they don't want to talk about their book, fine, then that's perfect. And I do tell them a digital version is okay. There's no way I want 1,000 books in this office. And they don't need to do that expense of sending me a physical book. I'm always very honored when they do, because they almost always will sign it. But at the same point, it's like, no, a digital version is fine. And I look at their website. I try and be able to have that intelligent conversation. I look at their LinkedIn profile, all of those various things, so that we do that. And that's what we do when we network with people, right? We've done a little bit of research about them. We've, again, looked at their LinkedIn profile. We know a little bit about their company, so that we can sit and have that intelligent conversation. It is perfectly fine to say, tell me more about what you do, and things like that, because we want it from their side. But then we need to be able to ask those intelligent questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And again, any subject, there are other people out there who are going to love talking about it. And now you might not do 2 a week like I do, but and then one of the other things is be consistent, folks. I mentioned that I have been on quite a few podcasts recently, and now some of them, I mean, we have pre-recorded months in advance. That's perfectly fine. I do that every once in a while. I try to not record more than a month in advance, because things happen. But it's also good to get it done and out of the way, right? But I'll ask them, when do you think this will be on? Well, I don't know, because I don't have a consistent day and I'm like, I'm sorry. I know that ER that's a really bad example of a television program, comes on it on Thursday nights, right?
Yes.
Or, whatever it is, when that comes out. And so you, as the audience, are looking for it. And if it's, I don't know, published when the spirit moves, you're not going to get an audience. But tell us other tips about how to really grow your podcast.
Yeah, so there are many different ways to grow a podcast, Deb. And one of the things that I can't stress enough is, to me, the real value does not lie in the downloads. Like I said, I've, the history
you get
of Vikings,
that one right person.
Right. I mean, I've done podcasts that have done 50, 60, 70,000 downloads a month in their prime. And still to this day, I do shows that do less than 100 downloads a month that still are transformational for my business. One of the things I always say is that over the last, 6 years that I've been doing this, if I only had one download generated across all my podcasts, I'd still be doing all of this, because to me, the value lies in the relationships that I build through the show in the forms of guests and other podcast hosts and that sort of thing. So there are many different ways to grow a podcast. Statistically, the average podcast listener consumes 7 different shows per week.
Right.
So
that's a lot.
It is. I mean, most of us, including myself, that are big podcast listeners are junkies. I mean, I love listening to podcasts on walks, runs, doing chores around the house. But I bring that up to say that's the best way to promote your own podcast is on other shows. A lot of people will talk about, posting on social media, and that's very important. But I wouldn't suggest doing Facebook ads for your podcast. Like, the best way is to be a guest on other shows, and that's free, right? Because if you're on a show about a topic similar to that of your own podcast, those listeners, they're already podcast listeners. They've already got the podcast app pulled up on their phone. So it's really easy for them to then go and subscribe to your podcast. So I would say guesting on shows is the best way to grow your podcast. Another way to do it is through syndication. And that's how I really grew my first show, The History of Vikings. So there are so many different online magazines, blogs, websites, trade associations that are all looking for content. They're what we call content mills. I mean, they're just, they have to be pumping out articles and tips and
Mhm.
content videos every single day
Mhm.
for their newsletter
Mhm.
subscribers and for their website visitors. Everybody's looking for content.
Mhm.
So if you can come to those, if you can go to those kind of content mills, those publishers, and say, hey,
Mhm.
I'll make you a sponsor of my show
Mhm.
for free. I'll
Mhm.
mention you on these episodes. If in exchange you distribute my podcast on your website,
Mhm.
it's a win-win because you're
Mhm.
getting content
Right.
and I, in exchange, am getting more exposure.
Mhm.
Exposure. So one of the things I did with my niche of Vikings is there was a couple different online history encyclopedias.
Mhm.
There was like a medieval blog, and these websites were just pumping out content every
Mhm.
day. So I would make them the sponsor of my podcast, and in
Mhm.
exchange, they would post my episodes every week on their social media followings, and they would
Mhm.
have, like 300,000 Facebook followers and
Wow.
that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And it was a win-win. And what I would
Mhm.
do is I would, again, right, build relationships with
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
gatekeepers. I would invite the editors in chiefs of these publications
Mhm.
on my show as
Right.
guests, not to
Show
talk
them the
about.
value first.
Exactly. Show them the value. Sometimes if I knew of them and they knew of me, I would just send them an email.
Mhm.
And in terms of like finding people's
Mhm.
email addresses, just sign up for a free trial with Rocket Reach, and you can
Mhm.
copy and paste a link to someone's
Mhm.
LinkedIn profile in that software, and it should give you their email
Mhm.
address. So I've used things like that my
Mhm.
whole career. So I would say, to answer your question, Deb, syndication and then guesting on podcasts are
Mhm.
the two best ways to
Mhm.
grow.
Right. Because it is about getting the information out there.
Yeah.
And is it a challenge? Yes, because there are so many. But the last stat I saw, and this is a number that's sticking in my head, and it could just be total fictitious, is that the average number of podcasts that someone does before they stop is 34. So if you hit 35 and go past that, you're on the upswing. And is it work? Yes. Now I
Mhm.
have a producer. I could not do this program without Kim. And she does all my scheduling. Now I do my editing just because it's easier for me to do it than to say, this is what I need done, because I don't heavy edit. I mean, unless something major happens, I take out the jibber jabber at the start, the jibber jabber at the end, and kind of magically make it happen. So it doesn't take me very long to do that, and so I just still do that. Now I know like you edit for folks. There's all sorts of ways to do that, but it's and you can do it completely by yourself. I mean, I did it completely by myself for years. You did it for years completely by yourself. It is nice when you can
Yeah.
have help doing it, but it's not a ton of work. And it's it has gotten me business. I mean, that is obviously the most important thing, but more than anything, it's, as you said, it's helped me build relationships. And it's just so much fun. And what's really fun is when you're somewhere and people, this total stranger says, "Oh my God, I listened to your podcast," and you're like looking around trying to figure out who the heck they're talking to, right?
Yes.
And then you realize that's me, they're talking to me. That's
I
so much fun.
I had a moment, Deb, a few years ago where I was going through the process of signing a new client,
Mhm.
and I had to meet with a couple different people at the company. It was a large company, so it was
Mhm.
kind of a process, them, signing on to work with
Mhm.
me. And I had to meet with I had to meet with their chief operating
Mhm.
officer, and the CEO referred me to him. He's like, hey,
Mhm.
meet with Jeff.
Mhm.
And we get on the call. It was a Zoom call, and Jeff is smiling from ear to ear. And he's like, I know you. And I'm like, what? What do you mean, Jeff? Like, this is
Yeah.
our first time meeting. And he's like,
Mhm.
no, I'm like a huge history buff. I've
Mhm.
listened to your podcast for years.
I love it. Mhm.
So one of the things I always say, because now the CEO and I are really good friends and
Mhm.
we still work together, 4+ years later, is, Jeff helped me land that
Mhm.
gig just
Mhm.
because he had listened to my
Right.
podcast. And it was such a
Mhm.
full circle moment
Mhm.
because, you know, at first, who was a client has
Mhm.
become a friend. He
Mhm.
lives in Colorado, so I stayed with him. We've been to a couple concerts
Mhm.
together. I recently, because he's such a history buff, invited him to be a co-host of my Vikings podcast. So it was this like
Mhm.
beautiful full circle
Mhm.
moment. But like that is the power of
Mhm.
podcasting right there.
Right. Right. Yeah, and you never know what's going to come from those relationships. It's introductions, it's friendships, it's all of those things, because you are spending somewhere around an hour with
Yeah.
somebody. Even if you're doing a much shorter podcast, you're going to chat with them for a little bit. A lot of the podcasts that I've been going on as a guest, they require pre-chats. In other words,
Mm.
they want to make sure that we're a good fit before they actually do the podcast. I don't do that. We chat for a little bit before the program, but we're also talking business. So, it's not quite so important that we become, best buddies before we start. I did have one person turn me down, when I did a pre-chat with her, and I knew she was going to. There was
Mm.
just something, and so I have a booker, and I went back to her and I said, she's not going to want me on, and she was like, no, you're fun, and there was just something, we just didn't click. I mean, it was one of
Yeah.
those things, and I was right. She said, nope, not interested, and I went, oh, okay. Didn't hurt my feelings. Didn't, I mean, and that's the other thing, folks. If somebody tells you no, it's okay. Move on. And maybe it's no, just not right now.
Yeah.
Or, that woman knew she was not going to have me on no matter what. And that was fine. And because we do want to have that rapport. In, my 1009 programs, there have been 3 where it's been a challenge, right? We just didn't click, and maybe that's where the pre-chat would have been handy, but where I would get done and go, now people still like the program,
Yeah.
all of those various things, but it is important that you can kind of have that rapport, and you have to, people are like, why do you keep doing this? Well, I like to talk, but I also like to listen, and I like
Yeah.
to learn, and that's kind of the mindset, as you said, that we have to go into this with. We have to be curious, we have to be asking why,
Yeah.
all of those things, because I always think, if I'm curious about it, somebody else is going to be also.
Mm, absolutely. Well, anybody that didn't work out on your show, Deb, they must have had a burr up their skirt or something. Because honestly, like seriously, I'm not even just saying this. I've listened to your show for years, and you are such a professional host. Um, doing this conversation with you today, we chatted for probably 15 minutes
Mm-hmm.
before we hit record, and I even, somebody's done this for years, get a little nervous sometimes
Mm-hmm.
before hitting record, and I think that's natural, because
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't get nervous, you wouldn't.
Right.
It
I
shows you
remember
wouldn't
hearing that
care.
Barbara Streisand still throws up before every performance.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. But you allayed all of my fears and made me feel so welcome and at home. Um, so yeah, I really look up to you, Deb, as a
Well,
host,
well,
seriously.
thank you. And you weren't paid to say that. And it is, like you said, there are those butterflies. I've had butterflies with several of my guests. The kind of the, oh my gosh type of can't believe we're talking to this person type of thing. But it's, as long as you're prepared, you're okay.
Yeah.
Back to that. You've got your questions. You know what you're going to ask. And I do tell people, and it's funny, I didn't tell you this before the program, be prepared for me to go rabbit, squirrel, right? Because sometimes something will just pop into my head. Now I try to not, get you totally off base. Every once in a while, I have somebody get a little alarmed look. And I had a guest one time. Now this is when we were actually still live in the studio, and I had a guest who was with a nonprofit that I
Mm,
actually supported, and so that was why I had them come in. But we were talking about how they used social media as part of their fundraising, getting volunteers, all sorts of things.
yeah.
And so she came in with her little piece of paper, and her executive director had prepared this little piece of paper, and it said,
Mm,
you will ask this and this and this and this and this. And she handed me her little piece of paper, and I went, you know,
right.
but because I already knew a lot about the organization. And so, but I wanted it to go well for her. And I've had quite a few people who I am their first podcast. And so I really try and put them at ease, and, don't intimidate them, things like that. But, I did question 1, then I did question 2, then I did question 3, and then I skipped to like question 7. And she went, ah! I mean, you can tell she's thinking, but that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. Well, the conversation took us
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
We did get back and get 4, 5, and 6 done, but it was just kind of one of those things where, it's that. And I always ask my guests, what do you want to talk about? What is the subject matter? And I try to get that in. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it just means I have to have them on again because we jibber jabbered so much that we didn't get them all done. But, I want to know what the guest wants to talk about.
Yes.
But that's, part of the preparation though is to go, hey, in your book, I read this, or on your website, I saw that, or, things like that. So it's kind of this, like we said, before you meet with somebody in person, you should be doing that.
And I think that sometimes by over preparing for
Mhm.
a podcast, you're
Mhm.
really robbing yourself
Right.
of the opportunity
Mhm.
to just have
Mhm.
a
Right.
conversation with
Mhm.
somebody,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
I mean, you can, one of the things I saw, love him or hate him, I saw a couple years ago, Gary Vaynerchuk was doing a little talk, and he said that he never prepares for any of his speaking
Mhm.
engagements because that's what works for him. And
Mhm.
he always says, like, if you got it, you got it. You
Mhm.
know, if that's your,
Mhm.
in my mom's the same way.
Mhm.
She's kind of an industry veteran in the homeschooling world, and so she
Ah.
does a lot of speaking
Mhm.
and traveling for that. And she doesn't really do that much prep for all of
Mhm.
her
But
speaking.
she knows her subject.
She knows her subject and she lives it. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? It's
Mhm.
it's her. You know what
Mhm.
I mean?
Mhm.
So I would say that anybody who's interested, and that's another cool thing about podcasting too, Deb, is some of the things that I've podcasted about. So for example, I never went to college, right?
Mhm.
I never went to college. I do not have a PhD in history, but I am interested. I know how to ask good
Mhm.
questions because they're
Right.
the questions that I'm
Mhm.
interested in hearing about. And in turn, you as the host are actually seen as the
Mhm.
expert. So
Mhm.
last year, the History Channel reached out to me
Wow.
and they said, we're doing a new show
Mhm.
about the greatest warriors in history.
Mhm.
We, discovered your podcast. We saw a video of you being
Mhm.
interviewed on another podcast. We think you're super engaging.
Mhm.
We think you'd be great on TV. We're going to fly you out to Toronto to be like an on-air
Oh my
historian,
gosh.
for
Did
this
you
show.
just like hyperventilate?
I did, Deb, and it was so it was kind of emotional for me.
Mhm.
Like I
Mhm.
remember right, because like I remember it was a 3-hour interview. The
Mhm.
interview lasted for three
Mhm.
hours and of those 3 hours they'll probably use all of like 3 minutes in a
I
45
know.
minute
Mhm.
episode.
Mhm.
But I remember like it was they put me up in this beautiful hotel in
Mhm.
downtown Toronto, and after the interview, the cab driver dropped me off and I went to kind of the hotel
Mhm.
restaurant and had some dinner and a couple drinks. I just remember thinking, wow, like I was 16
Mhm.
and was interested in history and
Mhm.
started
And look
recording,
what happened.
and look
Mhm.
what happened,
Mhm.
So um just like the power of podcasting, like I can't recommend it
Mhm.
enough. Podcasting made my life possible,
Mhm.
so
I
I'm
love
super
it.
passionate
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. And what I really like is that you're still doing that original podcast.
Yeah.
Because that truly was your passion. So you've continued to do it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's interesting, right? Because like, the history of Vikings isn't necessarily my business.
Right.
It's
Mhm.
not super heavily monetized. I get
Mhm.
free travel
Mhm.
every year and
Mhm.
that kind of stuff. But in a way that show led to everything. It's
Mhm.
like my business card. It's
Right.
my case
Mhm.
study. And
Mhm.
it's unique too. Like,
Mhm.
if I get on a call with somebody and they're interested in starting a podcast and they say, "Tell me about
Mhm.
yourself." And I said, "Well, when I was 16, I started this show about Vikings."
Mhm.
And grew to 50,000 downloads a month. That's
Mhm.
unique.
Mhm.
It's like everybody's used to these like
Mhm.
business pitches
Mhm.
where it's just all this
Mhm.
tech jargon, but
Right.
like here's somebody who lived it,
Mhm.
and I think that's what ultimately what
Mhm.
everybody wants.
Right. Yeah, because when we're having our conversations, we want it to be with a real person.
Yeah.
And I think that's where sometimes people get nervous when they're starting out. They think they have to be perfect. Now, I will tell you, I do not go back and listen to my early podcasts. Nope. No, I would probably go, oh my God, I can't do this.
Yeah, me
Um,
either.
and I really don't listen to the ones I've done. I might go back every once in a while just because they mentioned something and I need to, I need to, revisit that or something. But when it's done, it's done. And I go on. Is it going to be perfect? No, not ever. Me being a guest is not ever going to be perfect. But that's because we're human. And that's what I love the most about it. Some of our outtakes, are some of the funniest things that happen in some of the programs, where the dog wanders through, the cat. I mentioned, at the start of the program, somebody's cat. During COVID, I had one where I was interviewing a gentleman right at the very start of the lockdown. And this guy did not have a home office. I mean, he'd been in a real office forever and all of a sudden was literally at his kitchen table. And so, he's doing the interview with me and his kitchen is behind him. He can see what I see, right? So he sees his teenage son come bebopping in as quiet as possible. That kid made his lunch. You would have, if you didn't see him, you wouldn't have known he was there. And so we just kept doing the interview. Kid goes back and forth a couple times. The really funny thing, he takes his plate, he goes to leave and he waves. He knew he'd been on camera that entire time. But that's what makes us human, which is, I think, why a lot of people still really like Zoom is, we're seeing all of this. But, like I said, oh my gosh, sometimes we get to the end and we didn't even get to ask everything we wanted to. So I would love to have you on again because this is so much fun. We've just been having a great conversation. But tell us about Profit with Podcasting. How do people find you and what are the services that you provide?
Thanks so much, Deb. So if people want to get in touch with me, my email is noah@profitwithpodcasting.com. Website is profitwithpodcasting.com. We have some great client testimonials and case studies on
I've
there.
had a couple of them as guests.
Yes, I know. They're yeah, and they love being interviewed by you, Deb, all of them. So I'm glad I got to join you myself. But if you're interested in learning more about podcasting, shoot me an email. I'd love to work with you. And here's the thing. Even if we don't work together, I still think you should start a podcast and I'd still be happy to give you advice. You can podcasting can be as difficult or expensive or inexpensive as you want. You could buy a $50 USB microphone, create a free Zoom account today, and in a matter of probably 2 days, get something up on Apple Podcasts.
Yep.
I think that everybody should do a podcast. And I'm so passionate about this. And yeah, thank you so much, Deb. Like, this has been such a treat.
It really has been so much fun. And like I said, I mean, I look back through my emails and you first came into our world providing guests quite a few years ago. And so I love that we have just stayed in touch. And as we said, it's networking, right? That's what this is all about. And so for anybody who thinks, oh, it's a waste of time, well, you get out of it what you put into it. And I think that is the thing to really remember for folks is if you like it and you enjoy it, you're going to have fun doing it. Yes, Noah has a huge numbers. Maybe your numbers are 50 as opposed to 50,000, but if they're the right 50 people, that's all you need. And yeah, your mom is usually in there somewhere, right? But mine was not. She always got very confused as to how until she finally could tell Alexa to play the podcast, and that was really funny. When she could do that. But it really was. It's just so much fun, and you get a lot out of it. I think that is what we want to leave everybody with is you get out of it what you put into it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Right. Well, speaking of final thoughts, what final thoughts do you want to leave everyone with?
Every good thing I have in life, I can trace back to podcasting in some way. And Deb, I've been podcasting for over 6 years, and it's the one thing that's always been there for me. I've had good years in business. I've had years where, let's just say I was going through a growth phase. There have been really dark moments in my life. I'm on a health journey myself. I actually used to weigh 52 pounds more than I do now at this time last year. There have been challenges and hurdles, things that I had to overcome, but I was podcasting through all of it. And it was always there for me. It was always a way for me to meet new clients and grow my business, ways for me to meet new friends all around the world. I can't recommend podcasting enough. And some people say, well, I don't have time to podcast. And I say, what do you mean you don't have time to talk to potential clients, friends, advisors, and that sort of thing? So if you're thinking about podcasting, seriously, like just start it and send me an email, noah@profitwithpodcasting.com.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it. Well, I have been having so much fun speaking with Noah Tetzner. I am Deb Creer, and until next time, everyone have a great day.
Tune in for our next program for even more trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. The Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer, is proud to be part of the C-Suite Network.